I'm Alan Tansman, director of the Townsend Center. I'm going to be brief with my introduction. I should mention now that there will be a video of this event on our website in a day or two. I know we wait with bated breath to hear from Ursula Guin, and we're honored to have her as our Avenali chair in the Humanities and to help us celebrate our 25th anniversary of the Townsend Center. First, though, I want to say a few words about the Avenalis, who endowed this lectureship. Peter Avenali was a young man during the Great Depression. His Berkeley education cost him $25 a semester, a price that included tickets to Cal football games. The son of an Italian immigrant, he graduated from Berkeley with a degree in English literature, went to Harvard Business School, and then went to war. He spent 4.5 years in the Army, serving time on the front lines, including at the Battle of the Bulge, in which some 19,000 Americans died. Joan, a graduate of Sarah Lawrence College, was in the Navy working as a radio operator in Madison, Wisconsin, when she met Peter. They married after 4 dates. Those were the days, I guess, in 1945, during Peter's 30-day leave from the Army, and they honeymooned in Lake Tahoe. I sense there's another story behind this story, which we can't tell publicly, but I'm not sure. As for Miss Le Guin, I've learned, although I may be mistaken, a little bit about her life in Berkeley, where she was born Ursula Kroeber, the daughter of anthropologist Alfred Kroeber. Yes, that building, that museum, and writer Theodora Kroeber. Apparently, and maybe I'll be corrected, as a child, she distributed prizes at pet shows in Contingency Park. And kids would bring their pets, and every pet got a prize. An ad hoc unique prize for soulfulness or for loud meowing or for unusual spot placement. Moving from pets to literature at the age of 11, Miss Le Guin submitted her first story to the magazine Astounding Science Fiction. I think it was rejected, in fact. This is like the record company that didn't sign the Beatles, right? Some years later, she received wide recognition for her novel The Left Hand of Darkness, which won the Hugo and Nebula Awards in 1970. Her The Dispossessed made her the first person to win both the Hugo and Nebula Awards for Best Novel. Miss Le Guin has written enough books to fill a large library, more than 20 novels and dozens of short story collections, books of essays, criticism, and poetry, children's books, and translations, including one of the Tao Te Ching and another of the poet Gabriel Mistral. She has filled and formed the imaginations of generations of readers. In the old East Germany, a person who helped others escape over the wall was called a Fluchthelfer, excuse my German. That is a flight helper. Ms. Le Guin has been our flight helper, allowing us to find our ways into reality by escaping it. She has allowed us to see who we are in our real and in our imagined worlds. A brief personal note. In the mid-70s, in a suburban New Jersey high school, far away from Ecotopia, very far away from Ecotopia, I read The Left Hand of Darkness and felt the rush of a mind-freeing, politically liberationist manifesto. Somehow it spoke to me and some of my generation alongside powerful feminist works of that time like Shulamith Firestone's The Dialectic of Sex, The Case for Feminist Revolution, and Ty Grace Atkinson's 1974 Amazon Odyssey. Somehow also, Ms. Le Guin's work spoke to us in concert with Kurt Vonnegut's 1969 Slaughterhouse-5, Richard Brautigan's 1968 Watermelon Sugar. That was a long time ago, and later generations have absorbed her work differently. Here, for example, is Emily O from the internet yesterday. This book is utterly incredible. I love Le Guin's writing style. I swear she could write about paint drying and I would read it. On stage today, soon, with Ms. Le Guin is our own Michael Lucey, who I have to thank because I think he lost an entire semester of work as he got reabsorbed in Ms. Le Guin's writings. So thank you, Michael. Professor of French literature and culture, whose published work include Never Say I, Sexuality in the First Person in Colette, Gide, and Proust, and The Misfits of the Family, Balzac and the Social Forms of Sexuality. I don't know what Professor Lucey was reading in his teens and 20s, and one can only speculate on the role Ms. Le Guin's writing had in forming what his adult imagination would become. He is, however, currently completing a book called Someone, The Pragmatics of Misfit Sexualities in French Literature, and he was also the founding director of Berkeley Center for the Study of Sexual Culture. So once again, I'm very honored for all of us to welcome Ursula Guin to our stage and to thank her for coming down from the great Northwest. dude.
Yeah. I'm actually quite intimidated to be here.
You aren't the only one.
So just so everybody can hear okay? Yes. So just so you know what we're up to, we're going to have a conversation for roughly 45 minutes, and then Ursula is going to take questions for half an hour. So there you go, you can set your timers. So I was thinking, so thanks to everybody at the Townsend Center, first of all, for setting this up. I guess there is, as the event has approached, I've just had many conversations with undergraduates, graduate students, and my colleagues about reading Ursula Le Guin, and it just does seem to be kind of the experience that Alan was describing, that it's kind of an intense experience that sticks with you. Everybody remembers the time and the place when they read this or that novel, if it's The Lathe of Heaven or The Left Hand of Darkness or the Earthsea books or The Dispossessed or The Telling, a later one that has marked many people. Or not just the Earthsea books, I remember really strongly the word for world is forest. And I was trying to think, like, what was so important about that experience for me and how I would describe it. So the intensity of that reading experience as a teenager, in a different environment entirely, like that it left an imprint, or that it planted a seed, or that it built a habitation for thought, or that it gave you patterns according to which you can think about certain kinds of things, such as how to exist with the environment. So thank you, first of all, for all
You're very welcome.
All that you've written. So when Colleen at the Townsend Center asked me to come up with a title, I thought, since that experience of reading you has been so important and so intense for so many people, that maybe the title I suggested was "What Can Novels Do?" Because it seems like your novels do so much for people. And when you heard that title, you said, that seems like a title we could do a lot of different things with. But just by the way, I recently had a new collection of my short stories that's appeared last year, and also a collection of new and selected poems called Finding My Elegy. Both of those came out in 2012, so there's a problem with the word novel in the title because you do so many other things. So as I was preparing for the event, I actually read a book of yours that I hadn't read previously, Always Coming Home. And
I made him do it. Isn't that true?
Well, you suggested it with a rationale that was irresistible, and we'll get to your rationale. I have it on my list of things we're going to get through. The first sentence of that book is: the people in this book might be going to have lived a long, long time from now in Northern California. So that's a great first sentence for a book. And since you wanted to talk about poetry, other forms of writing than novels, one of the ideas that we had was that you might do a little reading. And this is a fascinating book. I'm not even sure we can talk about whether it's a novel or whether it's something else.
There's a novel in it.
There's a novel. There's maybe even two.
A short novel, yeah.
Yeah. But maybe can we start with you reading a poem from it?
Okay.
Yeah.
Glasses. This is the initiation song from the Finders Lodge, which is, and the Finders are rather uncharacteristic people of this valley of Northern California, because they actually leave the valley and go elsewhere. Most of the people who live in the valley of the Na stay there. So this is a song to these people who leave the valley. Please bring strange things. Please come bringing new things. Let very old things come into your hands. Let what you do not know come into your eyes. Let desert sand harden your feet. Let the arch of your feet be the mountains. Let the paths of your fingertips be your maps. And the ways you go be the lines on your palms. Let there be deep snow in your inbreathing, and your outbreath be the shining of ice. May your mouth contain the shapes of strange words. May you smell food cooking you have not eaten. May the spring of a foreign river be your navel. May your soul be at home where there are no houses. Walk carefully, well-loved one. Walk mindfully, well-loved one. Walk fearlessly, well-loved one. Return with us, return to us. Be always coming home.
So that's a beautiful poem, and thank you. And as a literature professor, you're always kind of, when you don't quite understand what a title of a book means, you're always looking for the moment in the book where it comes. And so there it comes in the last line of that poem, always coming home. And as I was thinking about that poem, I was thinking that it touches on something that is at the heart of a lot of your fiction, which is contact. Would that be the right word for it? Or exploration? Or
discovery.
Yeah, it seems to be like if you think of The Dispossessed, for instance, or The World for World is Forest, or Always Coming Home, that there's something about the experience of cultures that don't understand each other coming up against each other that is, for you, the provocation for fiction or something like that. Does that seem?
It's a wonderful source for fiction, yes. And I suppose it's not too surprising in The Anthropologist's Daughter to talk about two cultures bumping up against each other that don't understand each other.
And it was interesting the way that you described it. You said that the people of the Valley of the Nile usually don't leave home, right? Except that there's this class of people this minority of people who make a point of leaving home. And there are actually many stories in the book that are about people who have this urge to leave home and do it wrong, or in certain ways. And then this idea that there must be, that even though most people don't do it and so many people do it in the wrong way, that somehow it's essential to the health of a culture that certain people do that. Yeah.
I mean, that seems like common sense. If everybody stays home all the time, it get really boring. But these people who are very, very sort of conscious of where they live and aware of being there, there's this danger in going away that then you don't know where you are, who you are, what use you are, you go astray.
Was France like that for you?
Was France like that? No, France was a kind of always coming home, because I went to France young and I studied it very hard, and I was in love with France and French literature and French language, and so it was. But then they did speak French much faster than I was used to.
Yeah. They seem to make a habit of doing that.
Yes.
Yeah. So one of the things then that's interesting about, so maybe we could, I don't know if people know, so I don't know how many people know about Always Coming Home, but it's not just a book that tells the story of contact, right? So that there are many stories of contact, but in fact there's this one long strand in the book that is about a woman who is, I guess you would say, mixed-raced and leaves her mother's people to go spend time with her father's people, and then comes home, which is when she takes the name Woman Coming Home, so she's kind of at the heart of the story. But it's not just that the story is about that, the way many of your stories are, but then the novel itself, on a larger level, is also about that. That it's because it's, or to the extent that it's a novel, because in its form, it is about going to another culture at some time in the future. Is that?
The whole book itself, yeah. There's a voice in the book called Pandora, who is the sort of, who's apparently the archaeologist of the future herself, who has sort of dug up this civilization to come. It's all, see, I grew up in Berkeley, and we were here 9 months of the year, and as soon as college and school let out, we went up to the Napa Valley and spent the summer there. That was the pattern of my entire childhood. So I had these sort of two homes 60 miles apart. And the one that I wrote about in this book, of course, this is a book about the Napa Valley. Partly as I experienced it as a child, and partly as I wish it could be, as I've watched the valley be exploited and industrialized and agribusiness move in and the vines cover everything that used to be a mixed agriculture and so on. You know, it's sort of, we're not using that beautiful place quite right. And so there's a lot of wishful thinking in this book, and of wishing we could come around and be at home in a place instead of just using it that way, if you know what I mean.
So, so there's this story in the book, which is the story of she has several names throughout the book, but at the end it's woman coming home. So there's that story, and then there are a number of other stories. There's even a chapter of a novel, which really wish now I'm hoping that someday somebody will discover other chapters from that novel.
There is a second chapter.
There is.
There is, but the third chapter seems to have been lost. It was to be a 3-chapter novel, and I don't have to work on that third chapter.
But so could you talk a little bit about the process that you had in writing the book, since it's part story, but it's partly it is a kind of almost an anthropological study of a people that doesn't exist yet. And you said at one point in your email, one of your emails to me, that that you had to translate from a language that they were speaking in this future, and then once you had done the translating, which was the writing of the book, then you had to invent the language.
Yeah. This was, Tolkien did it right. First he invented the language. Then he invented the people to speak the language, They sort of grew out of the language. That is the right way to do it. And I really screwed it up, because I got my people, and I knew a good many words of their language, because, languages are different, and certain concepts I had to have the words for in cache. But I didn't have to do the language until I wanted it to be a kind of multi-arts presentation, and so I found my artist to draw the pictures, and I found this lovely musician, Todd Barton, who does the music for the Ashland Shakespeare Festival. Todd agreed to compose the music of the cache, and so we could have songs with the book, and there is a disc with it. So he said, okay, so we were all excited about that, and he's working out what their musical patterns would be and so on. And he said, they didn't sing in English. Oh, you mean you need the songs to be in cache, don't you? And he said, yeah. So I really had to sit down and sort of invent the language. And I had these songs that were my translations into English of a non-existent original. I had to write the original. And I think my favorite part of this entire complicated story is when we had done our disc and recorded these songs, we registered the copyright at the Copyright Office. And the Copyright Office wrote back in some dismay and said, these are folk songs and you cannot copyright them. So we explained, and they believed us. So.
Well, that's a great story.
It made us feel good.
Yeah. I know on the back cover it says that it was a 5-year project to write the book. So, and then you said this interesting thing to me, because you said, I'm so sorry that I've asked you to read that book. It's really, really long. But you don't have to read the whole thing, because it's in all of these parts, and you can find your way through it in different ways. And I guess I was wondering a little bit about that, as this, how you think about that particular structure of the book. Like, is there is there a right way to read the book, or do you imagine that people read it in all sorts of different ways?
They do read it in all sorts of ways. A lot of people, the novel that's in it is in 3 parts, and a lot of people just bounce from part 1 to part 2 to part 3 to read the novel, and then I don't know what they do with the rest of the book. But other people, I think, are more interested in the rest of the book.
Yeah.
And this was a very sort of, I had to be very brave to do this because my own natural procedure is to go from A to B to C to D and never bounce around and not take things apart and so on. Mm-hmm. And so it sort of, I was daring myself to write a book that's just all in pieces. It's a basket, and you can pull pieces out of it, you know?
Yeah. And there's a couple of figures in the book. There's Pandora. I want to talk about one moment in the book where Pandora has a conversation with an archivist. But there's also an editor, right? And so I'm guessing that there's a little of you in Pandora, but also a little of you in the editor.
The editor? Who's the editor? There's an editor?
Well, it says. I'm pretty sure I didn't make that up. As dictated to the editor by so-and-so, as given to the editor by so-and-so, redrawn by the editor from the Kesh map to include the names of towns, streams, mountains, etc.
I must be the editor.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Sort of the shadowy figure in the background. Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you, if you wouldn't mind, just a little bit about the conversation between Pandora and the archivist. Because a lot of the book is about imagining cultural difference in a way that teaches you about the limitations of your own culture, right? And so there's this conversation that Pandora is having with the archivist about how the Kesh keep their libraries tidy. You remember? And Pandora is concerned because she doesn't understand how this people could have such tidy and small libraries. And the archivist explains it's difficult. So Pandora says, so the libraries would all get to be enormous if you didn't throw most of the books and things out. But how do you decide what to keep and what to destroy? And the archivist says, it's difficult, it's arbitrary, unjust, and exciting. We clear out the Heimas libraries every few years. Here in the Madroni of Wakwaha, the lodge has destruction ceremonies yearly. Between the grass and the sun dances, they're secret, members only, a kind of orgy, a fit of house cleaning, the nesting instinct, the collecting drive turned inside out, reversed, unhoarding, and Pandora is scandalized. You destroy valuable books? And the archivist responds, oh yes, who wants to be buried under them? Right? It's kind of a fascinating moment where, well, maybe you have something to say about what's going on in that particular cultural exchange.
Well, again, I'm kind of daring myself to say this, because my natural instinct is that of the librarian is to save it. Put it away, keep it safe. Maybe so safe that people can't even read it, you know. But I'm kind of a hoarder, but I know where that leads. And if you live in the same valley and the same house, as it were, for generations and generations, and maybe centuries and millennia, you're going to bury yourself under your own dust unless you have destruction ceremonies of some kind. And these being very peaceable people, they managed to do their destruction without having a war to do it.
Then there's a very beautiful thing that the archivist says a few sentences later. She says, books no one reads go. Books people read go after a while, but they all go. Books are mortal, they die. A book is an act. It takes place in time, not just in space. It is not information, but relation. That's very beautiful and profound insight. And I was wondering if you had anything more. So suddenly it seemed like the Ursula Guin perspective had been in Pandora, and then there's suddenly this moment where the Ursula Guin perspective seems to shift to the archivist and ask you to think, what is the difference? What does it mean to think of a book not as information, but as relation? Do you have any?
I'm a little astonished that I wrote that before. This book is really when computers were coming into use, but it was not written on a computer. It would have been a lot easier if it had, I can tell you, but it wasn't. And the phrases like information wants to be free and so on had not yet been invented. They weren't referring to literature as information then, which is a trend I deplore. Literature is not information. Am I receiving a message?
That could be the universe agreeing with you, I think. Yeah, it's not information, but it's relation. And so that was interesting to me, thinking, what does it mean for literature to be relation?
Well, as a writer, at some point, I think you have to become aware that what you're doing is offering a thing to a stranger. Your book, your poem, you know, is really what you're doing. This is called communication, but I think that word it confuses the issue. But if you realize that in a sense it is a potential relationship. Any work of art is a potential relationship between the artist and the audience. It keeps your mind a little clearer thinking about it. And you know, and I mean that also not only just as the writer, but as the reader. You know, this is Tolstoy offering me a book. Wow. Gee, I better take that.
So there's a little bit of Ursula Guin, I think, in Pandora and also in The Archivist, but then there's a series of poems in the middle of the book that are written by an author called Little Bear Woman, which it's hard not to read as Ursula. Right?
Yeah, it would be.
So, and you said you might like to read one of those, so I wonder if you'd do that for us.
Okay, I think I told you, Michael, that this was about as autobiographical as I ever get, this poem. It's called A Song to Up the Hill House in Sinshan, that's the village, by Little Bear Woman. House, this place, house, this place, I'm getting old living in you. House, these rooms, house, these rooms, my mother was young living in this place. Northwest door, southwest door. Maybe my daughter's granddaughter will get old here, inside these rooms, in this house. Maybe I will come in sometimes after dying by the southwest door, by the northwest door of this house, this place, into this house, this place. I was given, as a child, I was given a sense of placidness, being in a place, knowing where I was, which I think has always been rather rare in the United States. You know, it's not a particularly American characteristic. It isn't exactly rootedness. My parents were from New York and Colorado. They weren't Californians, you know. But I was given this place, and it's obviously been very important, shaping me as an artist.
It's beautiful. And so the autobiographical element of that poem would be that it refers to your house in Napa Valley, or yeah. Yeah,
which is still there.
Yeah. Just as your house in Berkeley is still here on Arch Street. I learned that over dinner.
Yeah, well, we don't own it.
No, but it's still here.
It's still there.
Yeah, yeah. I was wanting to talk about another book as well so Always Coming Home was written in 1985, and Lavinia was written in 2008, but to me they feel quite proximate to each other. I don't know if I'm imagining that, but that sense of placeness is also very present in the heroine of Lavinia. But it's also kind of at the opposite pole. So if the project of Always Coming Home is to imagine at an indefinite time in the future some people living in California, a kind of a post-apocalyptic California, the project of Lavinia is to imagine a character from Virgil's Aeneid, right, who is the mother of Aeneas's child when he arrives in Italy. So, I mean, there are a couple of ways into that book, but one way into that book would be to get you to read a poem from Finding My Elegy about meter, right?
Okay.
Since it's a poem that turns out as it's about meter, but it's also about Virgil, right?
This is, I have to confess that this poem was written because I belong to a group of poets that, you know, we write and read each other's poetry and criticize it and stuff, which is a wonderful thing for a poet to have. And I think we give each other assignments every month, and the assignment was sort of to write something in a very difficult meter. And so I did a kind of a stab at the hexameter. And I had been relearning Latin for about the third time. And this time I got far enough that I could read Virgil, finally. And I was just amazed. So the title of this little poem is Ingenti percussus amore, struck by great love. Yet forever unfaithful, eternally restless, hard upon 80, I sit like the schoolgirl I once was over my Latin lesson, so that I can read, no, not read, can listen, straining intense to catch a whisper, a breath of the incredible music, the ancient remote song, hear the soft voice with its faint country accent, telling how shepherds quarrel for love, how from a chunk of the wood you can grow a whole olive tree, how the gods harry a good man. Are you my last poet then, Virgil? Last of so many I followed? None sweeter, none better, never so truthful a guide on the way that leads into darkness, passing the great tree that shelters false dreams in clusters like bats under its leaves, to the river of shadows and the dim fields where hurt souls gather in silence. You carried Dante up out of his hell. He turned away from you. I would ask only to stay with you. You and Lucretius before you showed me the shores where the foam of the breakers is starlight. Now let me follow you down as falling leaves follow the west wind to rest in the earth.
So that's great. The shores where the foam of the breakers is starlight is such a kind of remarkable.
That's Lucretius.
Yeah. So, but one of the interesting things that one might, questions one might ask, so often that Virgil would be your kind of last love as a poet, as you say, is interesting since one thinks of you as having lefty anarchist leanings, and yet people often take Virgil to be the poet of empire.
Yeah, well, I managed to have lots of leftist theories about that. I kind of exonerate Virgil from all that. He had to do it. You know, if you don't have copyright, you have to have a patron. His patron was the emperor.
Yeah, it's true.
Also, he wanted to write like Homer, you know, so he had to make an epic and so on. But it does seem to me that where Virgil's heart really is in the people, and he's wonderful with women. I mean, Dido's a tremendous character. There are not very many women like that in Roman literature. and there's a tenderness about him and a terrific sympathy for pain, which is, you know, extraordinary. So yeah, if you want him to be a poet of empire, that's what he is. But if you don't want him to be, you kind of don't have to bother about that.
Yeah. Although it seems like, so you retell, you expand in a certain way a character's, the world of a character, Lavinia, who in your book, you imagine a relationship between Virgil and Lavinia that's a very, what would you say, dear relationship between a poet and a character that doesn't actually go in the traditional sense that the character enables the existence of the poet as much as the poet enables the existence.
Yeah, well, it gets very complicated if you haven't read the book, because Lavinia is the Italian princess whom Aeneas is fated to marry, and she is fated to marry him. I mean, you know, fate is bringing them together. Clonk. They've got to get married. So, Virgil, having done the love story with Dido, was not going to bother with that love story because he had to do the battles now, you know. So he left me all this room to do the love story. Well, you know, people who are forced or fated to marry each other do sometimes fall in love. You know, so why not? Why not make that a love story too? But then the poet himself insisted on getting into my novel as a sort of a ghost.
Yeah.
And I couldn't keep him out.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's beautifully written again. I mean, the scene of the swarm of bees and the fiery tree is truly...
That's straight out of Virgil.
I know that it's out of Virgil, but I know that you stole it. I actually passed a translation exam on the scene of Dido's death once.
You can really read Virgil.
Well, no, I couldn't read a word now, but I have my PhD in part thanks to having been able at one point to translate about 12 lines. Well, there's something in the... I mean, it's in part because of the way that I was reading Lavinia and Always Coming Home together that for me, Lavinia seems like a cousin to Woman Coming Home, like a kind of that she has a related set of problems of that has something to do with fate.
Well, yeah, I mean, in the sense that she's a very grounded girl. This Bronze Age culture, after all. So this kid doesn't know very much except her little world and the Etruscans across the river. You know, she kind of knows about them. And then there's some Greeks down a ways, but you can't trust them. They bring gifts, you know. And then in comes this complete foreigner from a place they never heard of, Troy, escaping from, you know, from his ruined city. And he sort of brings his culture into her world. And she has to accept it because she's going to marry him. This, as a king's daughter, you know, king's daughters don't have any choice in who they marry. This is sometimes still true, oddly enough.
Yeah, there's something about fate, but I guess Lucretius got in there a little bit too, right? Because there's something about contingency in the way that that Lavinia talks about herself. Do you remember that passage?
Well, it's because Lavinia is quite conscious of being a character in a poem part of the time. So there's a lot of, I guess it's sort of metafictional.
Yeah,
what I'm doing.
I would think that would be the correct word.
Well, it's a lot of fun, I can tell you.
Yeah, there's a beautiful passage. She says, "No doubt someone with my name, Lavinia, did exist, but she may have been so different from my own idea of myself or my poet's idea of me that it only confuses me to think about her."
Well, she has to set the poet straight, too. I mean, yeah. I do not have blonde hair. I'm a South Italian.
It was fascinating to me the way that the project of imagination that created Always Coming Home or the imagination, that project of, or the projecting of an imagination to create Always Coming Home, it seems to me so similar to the projecting of imagination that you did back to create Lavinia in this kind of metafictional space. And another thing that struck me as similar between the two novels, and probably this is also influenced by the fact that I was reading through Finding My Elegy, the collection of poetries, is that both novels seem elegiac to me. And so I was wondering, I'm hoping you're going to read the poem Finding My Elegy for us in a minute, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the importance of elegy for you, both as maybe a mood in the novels, but also then as your poetic practice lately.
I'm not sure I know how to talk about that. An elegy is what is it technically? A poem of mourning? Of celebration and mourning?
Poem of loss, right?
Poem of loss.
Yeah. But it's also a meter, in fact.
Yes, and in fact, I did use English version of elegiac meter, but well, we live in a time of great loss. There's, you know, I guess it's the time I live in that I'm writing about. Oh, of course, loss is always beginning too, but.
Would you like to read Finding My Elegy?
This again was an assignment in my poetry group, write an elegy. These are fearless poets, I'd say. Finding My Elegy. I can't find you where I've been looking for you, my elegy. There are all too many graveyards handy these days. Too many names to read through tears on long black walls. Too many bulldozed, bone-filled ditches. And all the animals to mourn. Wiped off the earth like mist wiped off a mirror, leaving one face, reflection of itself alone. Image of its imagined image, nothing else. No grief, no dirt, no dogs, no elegies. That desert is no place for you. And so I looked where death is birth, and gods are animals, and being flows through being as from the spring the stream flows to and through the rivers to the sea. But what's to mourn if life betakes itself into another life? Better a rite of passage, painful, joyful celebration of the change, warning and welcome to the soul returned, forgetful who it was, and we not knowing either, seabird or child, salmon or fern or fawn. And on the eightfold way, although compassion finds itself at home, all the hard work of sorrow dissolves to breathing in and out, the lives let loose from turning, 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 gone nowhere to do no harm at last, after the long despair. So, where to seek? I used to dream of climbing high in the hills, those silent ridges red with dawn, to find your sisters, the laments. But that's a hero's journey. I am older than a hero ever gets. My search must be a watch, patiently sitting, looking out the open door. Far off through shadow, I can see a woman who stands to speak a name. Though I can't hear her voice across the ruins of the centuries, I know how hard it was to speak, how her throat ached. In Rome, beside the pyre or open grave, they'd say the name aloud 3 times and then be still. A name is hard to say. Who'd read aloud all those names on that long wall? What woman born could bear to know so many children dead? Numbers are easier. So the men of money say numbers, not names. Grief's not their business. But I think it may be mine. And if I have a people anymore, I will find them in tears. My Elegy, your clothes are out of fashion. I see you walking past me on a country road in a worn cloak. Your steps are slow along a way that grows obscure as it leads back and back. In dusk, some stars shine small and clear as tears on a dark face that is not human. I will follow you.
So maybe I'll just suggest two ways, and you could choose one or the other, or both. So the naming comes up in that poem, and it's been a preoccupation throughout your fiction. The Kesh have elaborate death rituals that involve naming as well. So that part of the poem is quite striking. I'm assuming that might be Lavinia also in the poem, since it resonates in the scene where Lavinia has to speak Aeneas's name after his death.
It was the Roman custom, say the name 3 times at the very end of the funeral, and that was the end.
Yeah.
Isn't that's something, huh?
So that's just one striking feature of that poem for me. But then the other path is that I know that you said in an email that you have things to say about being old, and that you think that people want to hear them or need to hear them. So whatever you would like to talk about at this point.
Oh, maybe that can come up in questions or something, because yeah, it's just that, you know, by the time I'm 83, and when you get this old, in a sense, I think you can be useful as sort of bearing witness to people to what it's like, because it's different from what they tell you. It's not exactly a golden age, but it's interesting. I mean, who ever expects to get that old? I sure didn't.
Well, so maybe we'll leave the question of naming open and the question of old age open, and we could at this point open the floor to questions that people might have. And I'm going to take a back seat, and Ursula and her public will just interact.
Okay. Thank you, Michael. Right there.
I'm just curious. I know that after Star Wars, Alec Guinness was tortured by fans wanting to learn about the Force, and I'm wondering if, after The Dispossessed, if any would-be Odonians kept turning up at your door and wanting you to come lead their cult.
Well, there are plenty of anarchists around, and I get many friendly letters from anarchists. Mostly of the pacifist variety, because that's pretty clearly what Odonian anarchism is. Yeah. But there's some very interesting minds among the anarchists, and some interesting publications coming out. So that was it opened up a little channel of communication, which has been very interesting to me. Way back there.
Your novels have been compared to ethnography, and
Two. I'm sorry.
Your novels
have been compared to
ethnographies.
Ah.
And over the last 2 decades, some ethnographies have been compared to novels. Unfortunately, not yours. What do you think of these comparisons?
I don't want to make a big generalization. I will just say something very personal in response to that, is that people ask me what influence my father had on me, you know. Well, it's my father. You know, fathers have a considerable influence. So it's an unanswerable question. But, you know, sort of, I do feel that he and I, whether it's influence or osmosis or just similarity of nature, that we are interested in somewhat the same thing. And it's a kind of ethnography. And, it's learning how people do things and in what relationship to each other they do things, and what the importance of these acts is, and so on. Writing a novel is rather like writing an ethnography. There's no doubt. There's a sort of, and also an intense interest in concrete details. You want to know exactly how they did it and what they did it with and stuff. And I think this is very important equipment, particularly for a fantasist, because fantasy can so easily just drift off into the gaga, you know. But if you tie it down to things, you make it real. So that's kind of the only way I can handle that question. Mm-hmm.
So we briefly mentioned naming. So we briefly mentioned naming, and the idea of a name and the concept of naming has definitely been a really interesting theme that I've come across in your literature. And I was just hoping that maybe get a little bit of your perspective on the power of a name and the power of naming.
After all, naming magic is a, I think, kind of worldwide, very widespread form of magic. If you know the name, the true name of the thing, you have power over that thing or person. And that is just pure magic. There's no rational. There's nothing reasonable, rational in it. But it rings a bell in all of us, I think. And that's the kind of thing a novelist works with. It's these sort of deep intuitions that are not rational. And they're very useful in writing novels.
One thing that was interesting about the cache, so that kind of idea that you have a name that you need to keep safe because it would give power over other people if they knew it. Of course,
the cache don't feel that way, but they feel that way in Earthsea.
No, the Earthsea,
Yeah,
that's the thing that one of the fascinating things about the Earthsea novels. But the cache are very different in that regard, right? They
don't really do magic.
They don't do magic, but they also don't have the sense that names change as people change, right? So people go through names as they go through life, right?
So you don't really have a permanent true name. So it's a kind of a losing the name in a way. You have a child name, and then a sort of middle of the life name, and then maybe a last name. I like the idea of having a last name. Over there.
So as your characters go on their voyages of discovery, there's an intentionality or lack of intentionality about breaking with the past and with the place that they're from. You know, does that come from courage, curiosity, boredom?
Yes.
And how maintaining the connection with the places that they're from and not losing those things is kind of curious.
Yeah, the keeping connection to the place you're from. In science fiction, I think this is a little unusual. Science fiction tends to take us off Earth and off we go, and we become somebody else with no connection to Earth. Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars series is a splendid example of just completely breaking, in a sense, with you know, you don't care about where you're from. And I just can't do that. I seem to leave my connections behind me like a slug's trail, you know. Oh dear. Right there.
Well, I just want to thank you for all your work, and I guess there's a microphone. Yeah, I want to thank you for all the wonderful writing that you have created, and you just mentioned we live in a time of great loss, is the way that you put it, and some of your writings are really, there's sort of bits in them that I feel like have helped me to learn how to carry myself through that, and through living in a time of great loss. And I just wanted to ask if you have any advice or thoughts for all of us in the room. Coming back to the title of the talk, What Novels Can Do, just advice for all of us as sort of storytellers or authors or whatever in our own lives, how we can use our words to help address in whatever way, whatever that looks like for you, living in a time of great loss.
Wow. Yeah, that's a kind of a question that I would sort of normally dodge directly, you know, because I do it indirectly through trying to do art, and I guess that's really doing art is the only thing I know anything about writing, you know. If you can make a story out of it, whatever's happening to you, if you can keep seeing that it is a story and that it does somehow fit into other stories, that it is going somewhere, you know, because that's what a story does. A story moves. The end is not the same as the beginning. All stories are about change. That, I guess, can be helpful. I think there are a lot of, I see a lot of young faces here, and this is a tough time to be young. You people do not have it as easy as I did. You really don't. That's a hard thing to have to say when you're old. I'd rather you had it easier than I did, which is how it was when I was young. I had it easier than old people did then. You know, so anyway, let's talk about something cheerful. Right there.
I just have, am I speaking loud enough?
She's got it.
I just have a question kind of building on the question earlier about name, was kind of the idea of language, especially in your Earthsea book. And I was just wondering with how you use different languages and like where that's coming from in your writing. To me, I kind of read it as coming from a desire for a kind of universal language or a language of the heart where everything's clearly and truly spoken. But I'm just curious, where was it coming from when you wrote it?
I think it comes from almost the opposite. It's just a lifelong, innate fascination with language. My own language, and I've always loved to learn languages and to learn bits of other languages and to hear them spoken. And language is to me, I imagine, what music is to a musician. I just love this stuff, you know. So I like to talk about it and work with it and play with it and invent it and so on. But of course, all languages do strive towards being comprehensible.
I feel like it's my duty as a French professor to insert at this point that Ursula wrote a master's thesis on a French poet. So one of her first explorations of foreign language was French, and she wrote about Pierre Ronsard, a very
ideas of death in his poetry.
Already you're elegiac.
Yeah. Oh, that way back in the middle. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yeah, you, yes. About who?
China Mielville's book.
Uh-huh, China Mielville.
And given what you just spoke about language, I guess my question is, do you believe that the different aspects of the individual language you speak have a deterministic effect on the way you think?
Oh, the
Sapir-Whorf.
Sapir-Whorf.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm sorry. I read Edward Sapir when I was a teenager, and he just shaped my mind. Yeah, I cannot help but believe the way your language phrases things is it must, you know, have something to do with the way you think.
It's very clear in Always Coming Home, the way you describe the problems of translating from the language that you haven't yet invented into English. Yeah.
I just remarked that it's difficult, but not as difficult as you might think. There?
I have a grandfather's question. I'm interested to see that 10-year-olds are still reading real books, but in a confused life with high-speed things going on around them. And I'm wondering, have you thought much about how you have affected that age group, or would like to, or have something that is relevant that they need to know kind of in this time?
Well, I have written a good deal for children specifically. I mean, I've written children's books, you know, which is a very different art from adult books. And kind of heavy duty. It's sort of scary writing for children because you remembering what it's like to be a child reading and how important early reading it can be to a kid. You feel like everything you write in a kid's book is kind of going to carry extra weight, which makes you sort of cautious, perhaps sometimes overcautious. I think the whole question of the sort of morality of writing for children is very complicated. The one thing that I just feel absolutely certain of is that nobody has any right to frighten or hurt a child without awfully good reason. You know, that's just a, you know, parental instinct, I suppose. But it can kind of tie your hands as a writer. And when does a kid get old enough that no longer counts? Well, that's okay, 12, 13, teenagers can handle a lot, and they do. You know, but it's a big problem. But and then of course there's the danger of writing messages to children. They don't need messages; they get enough of them.
Hi, so what is it about your current age that makes it a golden age? And you said something about that, and okay, not a golden age, sorry. And you said that that there were things that surprised you or were under discussed that you thought. I wonder if there's something that we need to be more frank about that you could talk about a little bit.
The thing is, I think when you're middle-aged and getting older, you probably have to fool yourself about getting old. You have to say it's going to be okay. It's not going to be that bad. When you get there, it can be pretty bad. The thing is, you are physically diminished all the time. And you know that you are not going to get out of it. It's not like being sick and getting well. So you just have to cope with a whole different sort of sudden, not sudden, but you may have to cope with it kind of suddenly. What's Frost's, what to do with a diminished thing? The cowbird, is it? What's the bird?
The ovenbird.
The ovenbird, thank you, the ovenbird. The question is what to do with a diminished thing. Okay, yeah, that's a big question. There's a lot to do with it, but you can't lie about it and say, oh, it's all wonderful. And I'm so happy now, and this is a golden age. It's that. You know, I think there's a lot of euphemism about old age. And I really do hate the fact that people won't say old, they have to say elderly. you know, and stuff like that. Come on. People get old. They don't get elderly. But then, of course, you meet old people who absolutely are in full denial of being old. And so then, you know, I have to shut up. Right there? Yeah.
Yeah, I think you started by talking about the human relationship with the environment. And I was just wondering specifically what novels or stories that you think deal best with that, and what point the direction forward from where we are?
Oh, human relationship with the environment is a very large subject. I will just take this chance that you offer me to recommend a book, a new novel, a fairly new novel, Flight Behavior by Barbara Kingsolver. I think this book has been misunderstood and misreviewed. You know, it's been praised, a nice book, nice novel. It's a very nice novel. It's a lovable and funny novel. And I think it is a novel written out of the same kind of passionate, informed feeling as Uncle Tom's Cabin was. This is the first novel I've read that really deals with the American ignorance of what we're doing to the environment. Why people are ignorant, and how come, and why it isn't their fault, in a sense, that they deny climate change and so on. It's a terrific book. So there's a plug. Yeah, right there.
Mm-hmm. You haven't reassured me about aging.
No, I didn't mean to.
I wondered though, is in writing, is The Day Before the Revolution, is that going to be your last written take on aging? We want the novel.
You want a novel about aging?
Yeah.
I don't think you're going to get one from me. I'm too old. But thank you for the thought. Yeah, right there. Yeah.
The other white-haired lady.
Thank you for speaking today and for all of your books. I wanted to ask, you wrote or asked the question once, why are Americans afraid of dragons? I wanted to ask, are we still afraid of dragons, or have we clipped all their wings and pulled their teeth?
The question was, of course, referring to the American tendency to denigrate fantasy and the full use of the imagination, and say, well, no, I don't read novels. I certainly don't read fantasy novels and sci-fi. You know, I read the stock report, I read the Wall Street Journal. You know, all those facts in the Wall Street Journal. Yeah. I think, you know, you always have to defend the imagination against idiots. Pick somebody, Michael.
Well, maybe the other silver-haired woman in the room who wanted to ask the question.
I like to say, when people ask me how I am, I say I'm in pretty good shape I'm well for the shape that I'm in. Okay?
Yeah.
That's not what I want to ask you.
It's an honor. Thank you so much. I want to ask you about Ishi. The shadow of Ishi, positive or negative or whatever you would like to say about Ishi, who I consider to have been one of the bravest people who ever lived.
See, Ishi died in 1913. I was born in 1929. My mother wrote the book about Ishi in 1959, 1960, I think. I knew nothing about him until she was writing the book. It was something my father did not talk about. It was a dark chapter in his life, and a long time ago. He never reminisced about anything, and certainly not about that. So people assume many people assume that I knew Ishi, and they always assume that I sort of, he wasn't the Indian I knew. I knew we had several Indian family friends who were extremely valuable people in my life. But Ishi, I know no more about him than anybody else here. And it's mostly from my mother's book. They asked my dad to write the book, and he said no. Ask my wife. and so she did it. And of course, she had him to draw upon. So then, of course, there is the question about this figure, this sort of reverse Robinson Crusoe, a man who comes alone, completely alone, into a completely strange society and culture. And you can see that happening in my novels all the time. I keep doing it to my heroes and heroines. Is this coincidence? I don't know. After all, when I was a kid, I knew a lot of anthropologists who went wandering off and stayed all alone doing ethnography. So it was sort of something people did in my experience. I don't know where it comes from. But it's a very powerful theme, being alone among strangers, you know. I think it's something that all teenagers feel. Yeah, who put me here?
How are you holding up? Can we maybe...
I think we should just maybe one or two more.
Say two more.
Okay.
And you have to choose, because otherwise I'll...
Oh, Lord. Well, right there.
Hello. Thanks again for coming and joining us here. I wanted to ask a question about the Earthsea series. So I noticed that in the first three books, most of the the main characters were all male, and then with Tehanu and the following books, I see a transition from there being these male characters to being mostly female main characters. And I was wondering what motivated the transition, and I wanted you to talk a little bit about like the difference in tone between these books.
Okay, the first three books of Earthsea were written basically in the heroic fantasy tradition that I had grown up with, that was the sort of English language fantasy tradition, in which the protagonists were white and male. And Tolkien, of course, was writing fully within that tradition, too. And when I finished the third book, I knew the series wasn't finished. There had to be a fourth one. It was like a three-legged chair, you know. But I couldn't write. It had to be about Tinar, the woman. But I couldn't write it because I didn't know who she was. I knew she'd gone off and married a farmer, but what'd she do that for? You know, you have the characters. The characters do things, and you have to find out why. It took me 17 years to find out why. And during those 17 years, essentially, is when American feminism was reborn. And little Ursula sort of went to school to some of the feminist thinkers and writers and learned how to write like a woman instead of pretend a man. And it was, I think if I had not been given that tutorial by our feminists, I might have stopped writing. Because I think I'd gone about as far as I could as a pretend man. I had to start writing as a woman, you know. So when I came back to Earthsea, it was still Earthsea. It was just the same, and you know, everything works the same way, but you're seeing it from a totally different perspective. You're seeing it from underneath instead of from on top. You're not looking down, you're looking up. That is to say, the position of the poor, the children, and the women who do not hold the reins of power and so on. So it just makes everything come out so different. And yet it was still my own dear Earthsea. You know, I could still have adventures in it just the same as ever. So I feel very lucky. Let's stop it with that one because I am kind of weird now. Okay.